Hello, and welcome to my shop. This is part one of a two-part series on building an extremely strong drawer box. I'm going to show you several different ways of making a drawer box, and I can tell you right now, it is uniquely different than anything that you've seen anywhere else. Here I'm using my sliding table saw to cut parts, and if you have one, you know how amazing they are. I can literally hold one corner of the sheet and with just one hand, kind of slide my hand, keeping pressure to the fence to make my cuts. But you don't have to have a slider. A regular table saw will work. In my nearly 40 years of building cabinets and drawer boxes, I've literally made thousands upon thousands of drawer boxes, and I can show you that this way is superb. So do me a huge favor, hang out with me. Part one and part two, they're kind of long and involved, but by the end, you'll know how to make a box that will last decades, if not longer. So I had talked to the customer, and to keep the cost down on this particular set of drawer boxes, we're using a 15mm Baltic birch. It's about a 5/8 thickness, and we'll be edge banding that with a solid wood maple edging. And even though these are only 5 foot long, there are a lot of rips, so I decided to take them to my brother's shop and have him run them through the edge bander to apply the edging. But of course, this could be done by hand. So if you're ever cutting thin strips of wood, or maybe formica, or even commercial veneer, and it's trying to get underneath your table saw, of course, this little fixture is simple to make, right? Just a piece of 1/4 inch, has a cleat. It engages on my particular fence right there, and it's locked in place. Can't move forward or back. And then you can raise your blade, make your cut, and nothing's going to slip under the fence. Sacrificial, they get beat up. Make another one in about a minute. So there's all my drawer parts, and we were having a little bit of trouble with the edge bander. So rather than trying to trim all this, which the edge bander can easily do, but it was starting to chip out and had new cutters, I just told my brother, just leave it. I can easily flush those with the table saw. The big time saver was getting all these edges applied to all these drawer parts, drawer stock, I should say. This is an excellent technique for flush cutting edging. You can see this is kind of sticking out on both sides. With my particular fence, this is a unifence, I'm able to raise it up, but you could use a sacrificial board clamped to your fence or even an L fence. And with that, you can easily and quickly flush cut that edging without fear of chip out from a router bit. So that worked very well. These are all just perfectly flush. Fantastic setup, and you can see I've got feather boards. These can move a little bit, which in most cases doesn't matter. But when I'm doing a bunch of pieces, I'll just clamp these boards. These have sandpaper on the other side, so they grab and they won't allow this to open. However, I'm putting a lot of force on this fence. It can cause it to deflect. So I just add a board over here, clamped, and that prevents that from moving out. So yeah, overall, fantastic results. Okay, so typically I would use a belt sander to get that edging perfectly flush with the substrate. But I decided to use my drum sander, and it worked amazingly well. And so now we can start cutting the parts and making the drawer boxes. So before I cut the parts, I'm going to run some samples. I'm going to be cutting rabbets to connect the sides with the fronts and backs. I need to know that dimension so that I can size the parts, right? And I like to make an 1/8 inch deep rabbet because it's easier to figure fronts and backs for the width of the opening. And I'm going to be using a bit like, I'll probably be using that one. I love that one. It has the insert cutters, but one of these would work. Even a router bit like this would work to create that rabbet. A larger diameter works the best, so that's why I'm going to use this guy. Of course, with many tasks, there's lots of ways to do things. You could use a regular dado blade, but this is a method I chose. Of course, anytime you change bits, it's always a good idea to check the collet and this corresponding conical part here. Make sure there's not any dust in there. You could even use some maroon Scotch Brite to get rid of any rust if there's any. This needs to be clean. Super, super important. And I realize I can be a little bit redundant. It's the teacher or production manager in me, but I see so many people complaining that their router bit drifts. In order for this thing to do its job, it has to be clean. So do your job and it'll do its job. Simple fact is that a router bit should never drift, ever. My dad was a machinist, so he drilled into me the incredible design of the conical corresponding faces of a collet. Okay, with the router bit in place, I'm going to set the fence to the thickness of my drawer material. This is a preliminary setup. I want to be accurate, so I just start by getting it close. And of course, a good habit that I've developed over the years, and you should too, router unplugged. Speaking of safety, if you think this is dangerous, then don't do it. To me, I love my hands on a small piece. I can feel it if it's vibrating. It's not going to slip out of my hands. You don't always need a push block. Clarification, I don't always need a push block. You can do it however you want. All right, and that looks just about right. But wait, there's more. I'm going to cut that in half over the chop saw. Right, with a sample ran, and you saw that I attempted to get the correct 1/8 inch height, but a sure way to check that is to make a sample piece, put two of them together, place a known 1/4 inch object in there, shank of a router bit, and I have a little bit of a space in there, so I know I need to go a tad deeper. So I'll just go up, maybe 1.5 thou. We'll try running this again. Just about right. The depth, I should have moved that. It's a little bit deep. That's easy to change. That adjustment's not super critical, but I want these as flush as possible, just less work later. The important one is the 1/8 inch depth. That way, as I'm sizing my parts, the math to add that 1/8 inch to the components is easy, right? So I'm using an undermount soft close. This is a grass, and the paperwork reads here that it requires a 3/8 deduction from the cabinet opening for the drawer width. So to keep from making mistakes, I just get a 3/8 block. I can utilize that with my tape and get accurate measurements with less chance of error. Now, there are a number of ways you could cut your parts. Of course, they need to be beautiful, clean, and square. I'm using a sliding table saw, but you could use a chop saw if you have a good blade and something to back it up, or even a regular table saw with a crosscut sled. So earlier we had used some random material to get this sizing right by getting the 1/4 inch to correspond to an 1/8 inch deep rabbet, right? So now what I want to do is run a sample in this known material. This is fall off, so I know that this thickness is exactly the same as all my drawer stock. Let's run a sample. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to cut this in half. So that first drawer box, I needed a 23 1/4 drawer. So I can put these together back to back, set my tape on 23 1/4 on this edge, right there. Look to the other side, and I've got 22 5/16. So that's the size of my fronts and backs that I would cut. That'll correspond with this rabbet, and that'll give us the correct overall drawer width dimension. Incidentally, when I'm cutting my parts, I want my sides to be the cleanest and the fronts and backs, if there's any of these footballs or whatever you call those, right? Those can be in the front and backs because you can put the good side to the inside of the drawer box and something like that will be hidden. Okay, so I've got some fronts and backs cut, and incidentally, these also I'm cutting without a scoring blade. So it produces a tiny amount of chipping on the bottom side, but that won't show. That'll be toward the back, or it'll be here in the front with a false front or a drawer front in the front covering that. So makes sense, right? So now let's just double check with those samples I made. I can put one here, Our target dimension was, our overall dimension was 23 1/4. Get out of my way. Boom, 23 1/4, dead on, ball is accurate. So spacers make a huge difference instead of trying to compute the math. You know, this isn't 5/8 material, it gets sanded, it changes. Use spacers and set up like this, and you'll stay really accurate. So by running two parts with the edging back to back, not only does that stabilize as it makes the cut through the fence, it also prevents tear out at that edging. There you go. We've got a beautiful fit, no chip out, nice and flush, and we'll be able to make our dimensions accordingly with that 1/8" rabbet. So what I have here are some drawer parts, sides and fronts and backs. And I should have ran this edging through the drum sander prior to attaching it, but I forgot. So there's a few saw marks and a little bit of difference in height here. I took this whole stack and I lightly clamped these on my table saw, cast iron, known flat surface, made sure that the bottoms were nice and flush. This is beautiful, dead flush, and just a slight difference here and there, and then of course saw marks. And we're gonna get all that out with a belt sander. Check it out. And sorry about the background noise. And yeah, there's a good chance if I would have ran the edging through the drum sander prior to having it applied, I might not have had to do this. But sometimes there's a little bit of discrepancy in the height, even though you're cutting parts of the table saw, it can drift away from the fence a little bit here and there. So this is an excellent way to ensure that everything is not only flush, but sanded smooth. I start with a 120 grit and then moved on to a 180. Little bit of sander mark from the first grit right there. The rest of it looks fantastic. So there you go, smooth. All the parts are consistent in height, quick and easy. So I'm assuming that you can't see this on camera, but right in here are some saw marks, and so this particular board here is low. Everything else is flush, smooth, awesome. And if I kept on grinding that with a sander, I really don't need to, right? So what I can do is the incredible card scraper and target that area right in there. About all it took, just thousandths. That's not going to distort anything. For what these are, drawer parts, you're not going to notice that this is half the thickness of a sheet of paper lower right there. And now you could hit this with a vibe, to blend all that. Probably not even necessary. Or even something like this. Literally that easy. Boom. That is beautiful. All right, awesome. At this stage, I've got all the parts cut and rebaited. Beautiful, crisp, clean, tight. Just a little bit sticking out here on this edge. So these are all the sides, right? These will correspond to the drawer lengths. And then over here are all the fronts and backs. So now we can start to cut the groove for the drawer bottoms, but actually I like to cut the drawer bottoms first, and here's why. The reason I want to cut my drawer bottoms to size first is because if I was to measure the sheet, around the perimeter, that won't give me an accurate reading of the actual thickness of the material, and I want my grooves to be really tight. And so by cutting the drawer bottoms first, I can then sand them on both sides, and then I'll get a good average of how thick they are, and the grooves and the bottoms will fit much better. And I'm going to be using a birch plywood, a 1/4 inch birch plywood, not the Baltic birch. I don't want any footballs showing, obviously. So let's cut those, yeah? All right, sizing. So these are my drawer parts list. This is the, so this would be the overall size. Overall. So that's the overall drawer size, drawer box size. And I always write it the same. It's really important. The width is first, in this case, 16 and 11/16. That's the width. That's after I've allowed for the spacing with whatever type of drawer guide it is. And then the second measurement is the height, and that is the height of the material that I need to cut. And then my last measurement is the depth. And the depth is designated by the drawer slide length, typically, right? So 16 11/16 by 6 5/8 by 18. That's the overall drawer box size. And then this number is what I will cut the fronts and backs. So this is fronts, backs, and then this last number is the drawer bottom. I'm just gonna do bottom. Okay, and I have a couple of specialty drawers here, this one and this one, and I just wrote myself no grooves, because what we're gonna be doing now is we're gonna be cutting the groove for the bottom, but my drawer boxes are a little unique, and I'll explain that here in a bit. And we've already talked about how I came up with the front and backs by using two sides, 3 1/4 material, that would be this guy down here. So we've got a 14 1/4 wide drawer box, and we want to figure out the front or back. We would put this, our tape, on 14 1/4, and on this edge over here, that will read 13 5/16. And then for the drawer bottom, I just add a 1/4 inch to that measurement. So 13 5 plus 6, 7, 8, 9/16. And that will be the drawer bottom. So when we cut the groove, it's a predetermined depth of a 1/4 inch, rather than cutting these and grooving them and then trying to figure out the drawer bottom to fit that. I do it the other way. A couple of reasons. So I can get the size right, and also I can sand and I can get the thickness of the material at the same time. So hopefully that made sense. It probably seems at first blush that I'm a 1/4 inch off, but the other 1/4 inch is accounted for with the rabbets on the two side pieces. All right, I've got all my bottoms sanded on both sides, and I've got a blade in here that is 1/8 inch, pretty standard, right? And we need to cut a groove or a dado. And I guess, just to clarify, a groove is going with the grain, and a dado is across the grain. Yeah, those terms get switched around, slang, whatever. So we need to cut a groove, the width of this bottom, and an easy way to do that is, this is a known measurement already. It's 1/8 inch. So I've got an 1/8 inch here to represent the blade thickness. And so I want to make a shim, and the total of the blade thickness, represented by this 1/8 inch shim, and this shop-made shim, will equal the thickness of this drawer bottom. So I've got 3/16 plus a 64th. Okay, if we subtract the width of the blade, that leaves us with 5/64. And so I have made a shim that is 5/64. Again, remember the width of the blade plus the thickness of the shim. This total is the thickness of this drawer bottom. And this works excellent if you're cutting something that's under 1/4. I can't use a dado blade for this groove because the two dado blades are 1/4 inch. I can't go less than that. So we're gonna make 2 passes with an 1/8 inch blade. And an easy way to do that, rather than moving your fence, is to just make yourself a shim. And I've already set the blade height of 1/4 inch. Lots of ways to do this. This is how I did it. And I made it just a tad deep. Okay. And you can see this shim, I have a little piece on the front and that'll engage with the work and we can make our cut. Let's give this a go. The method shown here of using a shim is an excellent way to achieve this. And once you start using shims in your workshop, you will find how invaluable they are. It eliminates measuring. It eliminates, in this case, moving the fence. I just run the piece twice, once with the shim, once without, and boom, we'll get a perfect fit. That's pretty snug. It's not overly tight. 0 gap. That's just right. So now I can get all my drawer parts and put them in the direction that I want to just feed these without having to look at them, without having to think. You don't want to be flipping them around and this and that. And those are all ready to go. However, here's where my drawer construction gets a little bit different. We're just going to groove the sides. Remember, these are the sides with the dados or the rabbets. We're only going to groove the sides. We're not going to do anything with the fronts and backs, and I'll show you why in a future clip. Okay, so by now you're probably wondering, why didn't I groove the fronts and backs? Well, here's why. We're not going to groove those. You can see that my drawer bottom is the same distance front to back than the sides. This piece of plywood is slightly warped, you can see that. But the way I construct my drawer boxes, that's not going to matter. This slightly twisted bottom will not make a twisted drawer box. So the reason I didn't cut those, we will cut these now to this height, right? And then these will sit directly on top. So that's the height we need. But guess what? Our fence is already set. We just need to raise the blade. We can make those cuts. And since we're cutting off the bottom, it doesn't matter that I have a bunch of different widths, right? We're just registering off the bottom against the fence, and all those cuts will be the same. Once that's anchored, that is perfect. We'll talk more about the reasoning behind this method of construction here in a bit. All right, so with all those pieces cut, you can see the top of the drawer box flush, the bottom will engage, right? And incidentally, all these pieces that you cut, you want to save half of them. Half of each length that you cut, or each. You'll need one of these per drawer box for a future step. So I've got a drawer box just dry clamped, right? And so now I want to talk to you about a unique way that I make my drawer boxes and why, in my opinion, they are superior. It's one key aspect that makes my drawer boxes extremely strong, and that is a term called rack resistance. So I've got this little sample here that I made, and this is a typical way that you would make this. I'm not sure what the distance is that the groove is, typically maybe a 1/4 inch up, not sure, doesn't really matter, but there's a groove in all 4 of these pieces. I've cut the back or the bottom a little bit small so you can see, I think you can see that moving. So it doesn't matter how strong the corners are, those could be dovetailed. They're still gonna allow for this thing to rack. See that? Now I should preface with the fact that I have made literally thousands and thousands of drawer boxes, a lot of different styles. We did a lot of commercial casework, working with architects. We showed them our design, and ultimately, or eventually, they allowed our design because initially they wanted doweled drawers, and they were a particle board. They were a melamine, a 5/8 melamine, and we showed them how we could make a rabbet in the design. Well, these are rabbeted, and that is a little bit of an improvement over a butt joint because you have raw material to raw material. Of course, you could use melamine glue, but still, you have a wood glue, so you have raw material to raw material, and it bonds pretty well. This is just pinned together, and then the bottoms on those drawer boxes were actually adhered directly to the bottom. Now, before you cringe, let me explain. With a melamine glue and a 1/4 inch bottom, that can be stapled with maybe an 1.25 inch staple with the melamine glue. The drawer bottom ensures that the drawer box is square, and you incorporate rack resistance. It's an incredibly strong drawer box. A drawer box like this with a loose or floating drawer bottom, well, if we look at history for a little bit, we'll realize that back in the day, that's how they were made, because they were using a solid wood for a drawer bottom. Now, I don't know how many antiques you've seen with drawer bottoms that have a solid wood bottom, but they're almost always cracked. And they weren't exactly like this. Sometimes the back was lower, the bottom went over. There was a slotted groove with a screw, and it would allow for this drawer bottom to seasonally move back and forth, expansion and contraction, all that jazz. I get it. But we're using engineered material now. If you have a bottom that is made of plywood or even say a 1/4 inch melamine or something similar, you don't have to allow for expansion and contraction. This product is stable, so why not secure it solid? So with this design, I can add glue to this groove, right? And then I can add glue on this front and on this back, securing that in place. This right here is dead flush. This is dead flush. I can check the sides, make sure they're not bowed. And boom, that is dead on square. Let's grab another a little bit bigger square here. I'm gonna go on the outside here. You can just see that, you can just hear it. That is perfect. So the drawer bottom ensures that it's strong, rigid. You get the rack resistance, and it automatically squares the drawer box. It's fantastic. Okay, so here we are at my shop sink area, and I want to show you the drawer that I was talking about. So this is what I refer to as commercial casework. A lot of Formica, melamine interiors, and this drawer here. So this is a 5/8 melamine drawer box. It's edge banded with PVC, right? And you can see the bottom is just literally attached directly to the bottom, 1.25 inch staples. And before you cringe or laugh, let me just tell you, that is extremely strong. So this is the bathroom cabinet next to the office in our home. Again, Formica, melamine drawer boxes. And this is the standard drawer box that we used for all these commercial cabinets that we used to do for schools and banks and just, doctors' offices where there's just loads and loads of cabinets, hundreds of drawers per job. And typically, most of them had a 3/4 extension epoxy coated drawer guide, and that covers the edge of the bottom so you can't see it. But it was constructed the same way. Melamine drawer box, 1/4 inch bottom stapled on with melamine glue, extremely strong. And in over 30 years of building this type of a drawer box, we never had one single failure, although we repaired dozens upon dozens of other brands or other people's cabinets because their drawer boxes would fail. And they all had one similar trait in common. It was a groove with a floating drawer bottom, and it lacked rack resistance. So eliminate the groove, or at least, minimize the groove by just putting it in the sides. And like I'm doing on that job currently, where it's stapled to the front and back and just grooved at the sides, and you get a much stronger drawer box. Now, just so you know, I'm not trying to convince you that this is a superior drawer box, that my way is better. What I would like you to do is think outside the box and realize that maybe a groove all the way around the perimeter of a drawer is not always ideal because of that racking capability. Now, you may remember I talked about these strips that I had you save. And so what we'll do is we'll take one of those. It's already sized correctly in length. We'll have to cut it down in height. That's easy, 1/2 inch. That'll slip right in there. Maybe. There we go, beautiful. And that can get glued and stapled in place, and then that will provide a place for these clips. So this is an undermount style drawer box configuration, right? And it needs that little piece, what I call the clip strip, for these clips. And if you're familiar with an undermount drawer guide, you know that they incorporate this little tab that goes in the back, and that just goes into a hole here, right? And you may be wondering, well, where are the notches that typically this type of drawer guide needs? Well, it's just because of the construction of the drawer box, which is typically like this. This has to get notches. If you build them the way I do, you eliminate that step. You don't need the notch. It doesn't really provide anything. It's not keeping the drawer guide from moving sideways because it's retained by this little tab. That's a wrap. So I dug around in my shed and found an old melamine box. This is just used for storage. I've since taken the drawer guides off, but this was the type of drawer guide that was, commonly used. You can see how it hides that bottom. And the other problem with a groove, and typically this groove is a 1/4 inch up from the bottom, is that when you add, if you're using this type of drawer guide, and I know these aren't very common anymore, but that screw would just split this thin material. It was crazy. You don't hardly see these 3/4 extension epoxy guides anymore. Full extension is kind of the new thing, but anyway, still a very strong drawer box, even though it's just made out of melamine. And I've literally taken this and slammed one corner down for whatever reason. Maybe the drawer, we didn't need the drawer, I needed the parts or whatever, and slammed this down on concrete, and you would not believe the amount of force it takes to break this. Conversely, something like this, that will fail almost right away because the bottom is just floating. All right, I'm done. All right, so I have this chest of drawers. It is sitting on top of this pedestal. Let me angle this down a little. And this pedestal has been leveled. It's true, no twists, dead flat. And so now I can start installing all these drawer fronts and everything will be accurate, right? Awesome, strong drawer boxes, no racking. That is so important to me, right? And you can just feel No rattle with the bottom. Fabulous. Let me show you something else. So if you have a wide drawer like this bottom one and these uppers, these two top drawers up here, it's kind of wide and 1/4 inch bottom, but an easy way to strengthen that is just add a strip of 1/2 inch, right? It's anchored here with a screw. There's glue here, anchored here. Yeah, that's fabulous. And that adds a lot of strength, right? This will be in another video on how I do this, and super easy. And it enables the customer to know where to put these drawers when they go back in, because you won't want to be carrying this with all the drawers in place. And it also helps me when I'm putting them in now. I can't switch that drawer with that drawer because the drawer fronts are offset. This one tells me this goes to the left. Hey, if you made it to the end of this video, I sincerely thank you. Come back for part 2. I'm going to show you another way to make a box, a drawer box, that completely eliminates that groove. You know, that groove in a drawer box, that is the Achilles heel of box construction. You know, sometimes you'll see an upper cabinet or a base cabinet and it has this groove all the way around with this inset back and it's doing all this. That is weak. There's lots of ways to make drawer boxes and I'm going to show you. Anyway, you got to get going because I got to put on all these drawer fronts. And remember, click, like, subscribe, learn.